My grandfather was always a man of few words, someone who had lived too long to care about what others thought. He never liked talking about the town where he was born. In fact, he avoided mentioning it altogether. Being a curious child, I would ask him questions about his childhood and family, but he would always shut down. It wasn't until I turned 18, when he was already an old man with a distant gaze and scars etched into his face, that he told me what happened when he came into the world. He spoke without emotion, as if telling the story was a heavy burden he needed to cast off before it was too late. This is the story he told me. My grandfather was born in a town that, according to him, no longer exists. A place that doesn't appear on maps or travel routes. A town with adobe houses, dirt roads, and an atmosphere so heavy that every dawn felt somber. A place ruled not by laws but by a group of women everyone knew as the witches. These were women who, it was said, had the power to shape reality to their will, making deals with forces no sensible man would dare mention. No one in the town spoke openly about them, but everyone knew they were there, watching from the shadows. People believed these women could smell newborns or pregnant women. It was common to hear that if a baby was born in the town, it wouldn't be more than a few days before they disappeared without a trace. The stories claimed the witches kidnapped them, using them in dark rituals to maintain their youth and seal pacts with powerful entities. In their desperation, some parents even handed over their children willingly in exchange for favors, more abundant crops, more livestock, or simply a slightly less miserable life. The town was trapped under the control of these women. My great-grandparents, like the others, lived in constant fear of being next. But when my great-grandmother found out she was pregnant, she decided her child would not become an offering for those creatures. My grandfather wasn't even born yet when they started planning their escape. They knew they couldn't simply leave as the witches watched every exit, and if they detected the scent of a pregnant woman, it was almost certain they would capture her. With the little they had, my great-grandparents managed to contact a man who transported livestock between towns and larger cities. This man, who was as tight-lipped as he was of dubious reputation, agreed to help them in exchange for an amount that, for them, represented all the savings they had ever accumulated. But it was the only way to save their child. The plan was dangerous and risky. My great-grandmother hid among the livestock, covered in manure and straw to mask her scent, while my great-grandfather took on the task of distracting any attention they might attract. The night before they left, the tension in the house was palpable. My great-grandmother could barely breathe, terrified that the witches would appear before they had a chance to escape. With every sound coming from outside, her hands gripped her belly tighter, silently praying that her child would make it to a safe place. That night, as the cart made its way down the dusty roads leading out of town, my great-grandmother listened to the cattle's lowing and the heavy footsteps of the horses pulling the cart. She knew that any mistake could be fatal. If the witches discovered them, they wouldn't just take her child. They would likely doom them all. She felt something watching her from the trees lining the road, but forced herself not to look, too scared of what she might see if she did. The journey was long and tense, but in the end they reached their destination. A distant city where tales of witches and black magic didn't hold the same power as they did in their old town. There, far from the watchful eyes of those women, my grandfather was safely born. My grandfather said that was the only time his mother spoke of her former life, and that from that day on, they did everything they could to forget. They changed their names and never again mentioned the town or the witches. However, there was always something that reminded them of where they had come from. Sometimes the paranoia of thinking someone was watching them, seeing shadows out of the corner of their eyes in the dark of night, or even disturbing dreams. Sometimes, as night fell, my great-grandmother would wake up trembling, swearing she had heard whispers, voices of women cursing her son and his existence. In time, they learned that the town had been abandoned. The people who tried to escape, like my great-grandparents, left little by little. Those who stayed no longer had children because the fear was too great. In the end, the houses were left empty, and the witches, if they were still there, vanished among the ruins. Unfortunately, the story didn't end there. The few who have returned say that place still lives, but in a dark and macabre way. Some explorers have tried to enter the town, only to come running out minutes later. They say the atmosphere there is suffocating, as if the very air is charged with a malignant energy. There are those who claim to have seen old, sickly-looking women emerge from the forest, watching them from afar, just as the witches did with newborns. Others say they were attacked by stones that came out of nowhere, as if the town itself didn't want anyone to step on its cursed land. One of the most unsettling stories is of a group of young people who, a few years ago, decided to camp near the place. They did it as a challenge, to prove they didn't believe the stories. But that same night, something strange happened. One of them wandered off from the camp, drawn by a figure he thought he saw among the trees. Worried, the others went after him but couldn't find him. It wasn't until dawn that they discovered him, in a state of shock, unable to speak. His eyes were wide and his hands were trembling. When they brought him back to the city, all he could say was that he had seen a woman with black eyes, dressed in rags, watching him from a distance and starting to crawl toward him on all fours, almost like she was dragging herself. The story of that town has been buried in oblivion, just like the people who once lived there. My grandfather always warned me never to try to find that place, that some secrets are better left where they belong. And although that town is now empty, something tells me the witches never truly left. They may no longer be alive, but what they did in life bound them forever to that place, condemned to watch from the shadows those who dare to trespass on their land. Those pacts, those lives they took, are not easily forgotten. I don't want to share the name of the town where this story took place. It's not for mystery or to add a dramatic flair to what I'm about to tell, but because I want to protect it. It's a small place, almost forgotten by time, and only a few older families still live there in peace. If the story were to go viral, I fear that curious tourists or paranormal explorers would start arriving, disturbing the tranquility of the elderly who still call it home. The town in question is practically a ghost itself. With no more than 8 inhabited houses, the rest are crumbling ruins that time and nature have reclaimed. When I was a child, my parents used to take me to visit my grandparents who had lived in that place for as long as I could remember. Life there was simple, without the luxuries of the city, but for a 10-year-old like me, it was a paradise of freedom. My younger brother and I would ride our bikes, exploring the entire area from end to end, without worrying about traffic or the dangers we would face in a city. The town was safe, and although everything seemed run down and obviously abandoned, we felt comfortable exploring every corner. There was one house in particular that always caught our attention. It was set apart from the rest, on the edge of the town, solitary, and with an air of mystery that intrigued us. Every time we passed by, we would see 3 children playing in the yard. They weren't like the other elderly few left in the town. These children always looked serious, almost distant, but they never spoke to us. They just stayed there, watching us with a mix of curiosity and distrust. My brother and I would try to greet them, but we never got a response. They would just stare at us and sometimes turn their backs as if our presence didn't matter to them. Several summers went by like that. Sometimes the children were in the yard, other times they weren't. Over time, we paid them less attention, assuming they were just another family who, somehow, had stayed in that ruined town. Our grandparents never mentioned them, and we didn't talk much about them either. They were just another part of that peculiar landscape. However, one afternoon, something changed. My brother and I were riding our bikes past the house, and as usual, we saw the 3 children playing in the yard. The strange thing was that this time, they didn't seem to be alone. Upon looking more closely, we noticed a figure in the window of the house. Between the dirty and torn curtains, an older woman was watching us with an expression that chilled our blood. Her face was deeply wrinkled and her gaze was filled with pure hatred, as if our mere presence enraged her. The way her eyes pierced through us from the shadows of the house made my brother stop in his tracks. He looked at me, and I could see the fear in his eyes. Suddenly, the children who had been playing outside stopped what they were doing and turned toward the window, as if they too had sensed the presence of the woman. They ran toward the house, hurriedly entering and shutting the door behind them. At that moment, the woman yanked the curtains closed, covering the window and disappearing from our view. It all happened in a matter of seconds, but to us, it felt like an eternity. Without thinking twice, we turned around and rushed back to our grandparents' house. Fear propelled us, sweat ran down our faces, and by the time we reached their house, we could barely speak. Between gasps, we told them what we had just seen. The children, the woman, her expression of rage, and the feeling that something was terribly wrong in that house. My grandparents, who had been calm until that moment, exchanged worried glances, and my grandfather was the first to speak. "What house?" he asked, frowning. "There are no families with children here. It's been years since young people have lived in this town, let alone children." We insisted. We explained where the house was, described the children and the woman, but they only seemed more and more confused. My grandmother mumbled something about how strange the situation was, while my grandfather got up from his chair with a serious look on his face. He told us to come with him, that he wanted us to show him the house. We all went together toward the house in question. My grandfather didn't seem convinced, but he let us lead the way. When we arrived, we pointed to the house from a distance, the same one where we had seen the children and the woman. My grandfather stopped in his tracks and looked at us seriously. "Are you sure it's this one?" he asked. We nodded because we were absolutely sure. There was no other house in that part of the town. "That house has been abandoned for decades," my grandfather said. "No one has lived there in at least 30 years. My brother and I looked at him in disbelief. There was something in his tone that unsettled us. To prove his point, my grandfather crossed the overgrown yard and approached the house's door. With the creak of old wood and the squeal of rusty hinges, he opened the door. The inside was as decrepit as the outside. The walls were covered in mold, the ceiling looked like it was about to cave in, and there was no furniture. No sign that anyone had lived there for a long time. The air inside was dense and cold, as if time had stopped in that house. Our grandparents looked at us expecting an explanation, and with some irritation. But we didn't know what to say. We were sure of what we had seen: the children, the woman in the window. How was it possible that the house was abandoned when we had always seen people inside? After that day, we avoided passing by that house. Something about it made us feel uneasy, as if just getting close could bring back that hateful stare the woman had given us from the window. As I grew up, the image of those children and the strange woman faded, like a nightmare you prefer to forget. However, every time I returned to visit my grandparents, I couldn't help but think about that house. My grandfather passed away a few years ago, taking with him his own secrets about that town, and my grandmother moved to the city shortly after. The town became even more deserted than it already was. We never heard from that house or those children again. But recently, while reading about urban explorers and abandoned places, I came across a forum where people mentioned forgotten towns, and one person described a place almost like my grandparents'. A user talked about a place they visited, where they claimed to have seen an old house with children playing outside. According to them, there was a figure hidden among the trees near the children, watching, but they couldn't see who it was. They said that when they noticed it, they felt a heavy vibe around them, and something made them leave before anything else could happen. Reading that made me feel uneasy. I don't know if what we saw that afternoon were encounters with spirits of the past, a vision of an alternate reality, or something more sinister. But one thing is for sure, there's something in that town that we'll never be able to explain. And that's why I'd rather not tell you where it is. Some things are better left alone. Thank you everyone for listening to my story. I want to tell you a story my grandfather shared with me when he was near his deathbed. The truth is, I never saw him as a superstitious person, or one to believe in ghosts or things like that. But what he told me was so shocking that it has stayed with me ever since. I don't usually share it with anyone, but since we talk about experiences like these on this channel, I think this is the place to vent a little. My grandfather lived in a mining town back in the 1960s. That place had once been prosperous, with hundreds of families depending on the mine, but over time, life there changed dramatically. The mine had a massive accident in which more than 20 workers were trapped and killed under tons of rock. Rescue attempts failed, and most of the families decided to leave shortly after. The place gradually emptied out, turning into a ghost town. Collapsed houses, deserted streets, and the mine completely shut down. By then, my grandfather was practically the last one left. It wasn't that he enjoyed the isolation. He simply had nowhere else to go at the time. It wasn't easy to find work elsewhere, and selling property in such a desolate place was impossible. So he stayed. He had his small cabin at the edge of town and lived off what little he could hunt and grow. The one thing he was never short on was silence. A silence that, according to him, started to become disturbing. At first, my grandfather said it was a peaceful, calm place. But things changed after a few months. He told me that, at night, he began to hear noises. They were thuds, like someone banging the ground from inside the mine. He thought they might be small cave-ins or the echo of the wind blowing through the abandoned tunnels. But the sound was too consistent, too strong to be just that. It didn't take long for it to become unsettling. One night, just as he was about to go to bed, those thuds resonated so loudly that they made him get out of bed. It was like someone was desperately shouting to be let out, he told me in a trembling voice when he shared the story. He lit his oil lamp and, despite the fear he felt, decided to approach the mine. He confessed to me that it was the worst decision of his life. The night was calm, with the full moon illuminating the landscape. Only the creak of wood under his boots and those thuds, growing clearer as he got closer, could be heard. There were no signs of life in the entire town. When he reached the sealed entrance of the mine, the thuds stopped. Suddenly, everything was drowned in an eerie silence, and the air carried a strange smell, like damp earth mixed with sulfur. My grandfather wasn't easily frightened, but in that moment, something deep inside him screamed that he wasn't alone. He stood there in front of the sealed mine and swore he saw a flash of light, a kind of faint glow coming from the cracks in the wooden board sealing the entrance. It wasn't a reflection or fire, but something stranger. Then, out of the shadows, he saw silhouettes. He told me that at first he thought his mind was playing tricks on him after everything that had happened, that maybe they were shadows cast by trees or rocks. But no, he couldn't fool himself, and deep down he knew. They were the figures of men, the miners who had died in the accident. Their bodies were covered in dust and soot, and they had vacant stares. But what terrified him the most was that they didn't seem to be seeking help. They didn't want to be freed. Somehow he knew. What they really wanted was something else. Company. My grandfather's heart started racing in his chest. He tried to move, to back away, but his legs wouldn't respond. I was trapped, like the fear had nailed me to the ground, he told me. He was on the verge of panicking when suddenly a blast of cold air hit him and snapped him out of the trance. He ran back to his cabin without looking back, with the feeling that those silhouettes were following him at a distance, though he never saw anything when he turned around. That night he couldn't sleep, and for several days he felt sick, as if something had drained all his energy. He decided he couldn't stay in that place any longer. The next day, he packed up what little he had and left the town for good. The strangest thing happened afterward. On his journey to a nearby town, where he planned to sell some of his belongings to start over, he stopped at a shop along the way. There, while talking with one of the old merchants, he heard a story that left him disturbed. They told him that the mine accident had been worse than what was publicly known. Apparently, many of the bodies were never recovered, and the mine had been sealed hastily. Rumor had it that some of the miners were still alive for days, trapped inside, and their souls never found peace. They believe they are bound to that place. My grandfather lived the rest of his life far from that cursed mine, but he never forgot what he had seen. He always wondered what might have happened if he hadn't run that night. Maybe something would have drawn him into that mine and he would have become another soul trapped, destined to wander in the underground darkness. No one knows. Before he died, my grandfather confessed to me that for a long time he had nightmares where those miners came to find him, calling him from the darkness, from beneath the earth. They never truly left me alone, he said. They knew I had seen them and they wanted me to join them. That's why I've never gone back to that place. It still exists, and some people say it's possible to visit the ruins of the town, though no one stays for long. The air there is too heavy, and often, if you get close to the mine, you can still hear the thuds. To this day, I haven't revealed the name of that town, not because I'm afraid of being judged or laughed at, but because I don't want people, out of simple curiosity, to go disturb the place. Whoever is there, whether it's the spirits of the miners or whatever remains of them, deserves to rest in peace, or at least, to stay where they are. In the summer of 2002, my family and I decided to take a road trip across the United States. We had everything planned, driving through small towns, escaping the hustle and bustle of the city, and enjoying peaceful landscapes. There were 4 of us. My wife Julia, our 2 children, Sophia and Tomas, and me, Miguel. I remember the day when everything happened. One of those days when the heat seemed to stick to your skin and the car's air conditioning barely made a difference. Everything was going fine until the car started acting up. At first, I thought it wasn't a big deal, that it just needed a little adjustment. But soon I realized the problem was more serious. The car began to jerk and lose speed. With every second that passed, the engine sounded worse. Julia noticed something was wrong and looked at me worriedly from the passenger seat. "Miguel, what's happening?" she asked. "I don't know," I replied, trying to stay calm. "It seems like something's wrong with the engine." Luckily, we were near a small town. Julia checked the map while trying to keep the kids calm. Sophia and Tomas, who were 12 and 10 years old at the time, were playing in the back seat, unaware of the situation. Julia told me there was a town a couple of kilometers away and maybe we could find help there. The car barely made it to the edge of the town before the engine died completely. I parked it next to an old cabin, one of those that looked like it had been there forever, with a dusty porch and windows covered in cobwebs. Julia and I exchanged nervous glances, but we had no other choice. I knocked on the cabin door, and after a few moments, an older man opened it. His face was weathered from the sun, he was wearing dirty overalls, and his expression was very cold. "What do you need?" he asked in a dry, direct tone. I explained what had happened with our car and asked if there was a mechanic nearby. The man shook his head and frowned. "The nearest mechanic is 2 hours away. No one's coming until tomorrow," he said, glancing at the sky. "You'll have to stay here tonight." Julia tensed up. Something about the way he said it made us uncomfortable, but we didn't have many alternatives. "You can stay at my brother's cabin," the man continued. "He lives deeper in the woods. He used to rent out some cabins. Maybe he'll let you stay for the night." Then he paused and added, "But I warn you, the townspeople aren't too friendly with outsiders." The tone of his voice was what unsettled me the most. There was no hospitality in his offer. It was more like a kind of warning. Despite that, we couldn't stay on the road, so we accepted. We walked through the woods, following the directions the farmer gave us. Eventually, we reached another cabin, a bit more well-kept than the previous one, but still old and with that air of abandonment covering everything. The man's brother greeted us, but he wasn't much friendlier. He let us stay in one of his cabins, though before leaving, he gave us a strange warning. "Don't go out at night, it's not safe." The way he said it left us uneasy, but we decided not to think too much about it. However, the hours dragged by. The atmosphere in the cabin was oppressive, and to make matters worse, we realized we hadn't brought enough food for dinner. With hunger starting to set in, I made a decision. I'd go out and try to find some food in town. Julia wasn't too keen on the idea, but we couldn't just stay hungry. So, with a few flashlights, we all went out together, with Sophia and Tomas by our side. From the moment we stepped outside, I felt something was off. The town was completely silent, The few houses we saw were in bad shape, and there wasn't a single person outside. There were no stores open, and the few people we saw were glaring at us from their windows with disdain. It was as if they knew we didn't belong there and wanted us gone. After walking in vain for a while, finding nothing, we decided to return to the cabin. But when we arrived, we noticed something disturbing. There were fresh footprints around the door, as if someone had been lurking around while we were gone. Julia became nervous and gripped Tomas's hand tightly. I also had a knot in my stomach but tried to stay calm. That night, as we tried to sleep, Sophia was the first to notice something strange. She came up to me in bed, her eyes filled with fear, and told me there was someone outside. It was 2 a.m., so I immediately got up, worried, and went to the window. There, between the shadows of the trees, I saw a dark figure watching us. My heart dropped, but I didn't want to alarm the others, so I quickly closed the curtains. A few minutes later, there were knocks on the windows. At first, they were soft, like someone was throwing small stones, but then they grew louder. Julia hugged the kids while I tried to stay calm. The voices started shortly after, shouting from all around us. The insults and threats were clear. They wanted us gone. The last straw came when a man appeared at the window holding something in his hands. At first, I couldn't understand what it was, but then I saw it clearly. It was a freshly severed pig's head, still dripping blood. The man looked at us with hatred and lifted the head as a warning. I decided we couldn't stay there another second. We gathered our things as quickly as we could and prepared to leave. When I opened the door, the man with the pig's head was gone, but in the distance, we could still hear the townspeople's shouts chasing us off their land. We ran to the car with our hearts in our throats. After just one attempt, the engine roared to life, and without looking back, I sped down the dark road, leaving that cursed town behind. The hostile stares, the threats, the pig's head, the stone attacks. It all felt like a nightmare. We never went down that road again. But what I know for sure is that it was the last road trip we ever took without knowing exactly where we were going. Sometimes there are places better left unvisited.